We're going to begin by looking at our image and setting our dark and light values. Generally, we want to achieve the deepest blacks and the whitest whites while at the same time retaining detail in those areas. I'm going to use Photoshop and the camera raw filter within it. Lightroom and Lightroom Classic have pretty much the identical menu system. If you're using a cell phone, you can use Snapseed, Photoshop Express, or any other program that will allow the adjustment of exposure in dark and light values. So we'll begin by analyzing our image. We're going to set our blacks and whites, adjust the overall exposure, and then we'll also look at making more nuanced, targeted adjustments within the image as well. We'll begin with this photo of a baby, which has some obvious issues, but our plan of attack here is first that we're going to analyze the issue and see what needs to be done. And then we'll set our deepest black values in shadow areas, and then we'll set our highlights in white areas. So that'll give us our two extremes for tonal value. And then we'll look at our middle values, which is referred to as the exposure of the image, to lighten or darken that. And then we'll get into a more targeted adjustments as we see needed. So I'm going to open this photo up in the camera raw filter, which is under the filter menu in Photoshop. And this will bring up a bunch of sliders on the right-hand side and this graph at the top, which is our histogram. This similar thing will be found in Lightroom or Lightroom Classic as well. So looking at the histogram at the top, we see at the left-hand side, if we put our cursor over it, it shows that our area of blacks. The next area as we move to the right is our shadow area. Then the middle is our exposure. To the right of that are our highlights, and then to the right of that are white areas. And this relates to the sliders that we have down below here. So I'm going to start with the blacks. So I want to set my maximum black. And if I move the slider to the left to get it blacker and blacker, you can see two things that happen. We start getting these blue areas, and I get a spike right on the left-hand edge of the histogram, both of which are showing areas that are getting completely blocked up and losing all detail. I don't want that. So I'm going to slide the slider back towards the right until we lose the blue area. And I lose the spike on the left-hand side of the histogram. Moving on to the white area, which is going to be the extreme right-hand side of the histogram, I want to lighten the whites as much as possible by the same token, and you can see as I move it to the right, I start getting these red areas, and the red areas correspond to the spike I see on the right-hand side of the histogram, again showing lost detail. These are whites that are getting completely blown out, and I'm losing all sense of detail whatsoever that was there. So I'm going to slide it back until I lose those red areas. And so now we've increased the whites a little bit, and I'm going to move on to our shadows. Our shadows are going to be the next area of dark from the blacks, and especially in terms of portraits and shots of people, I like to keep the shadows a little bit lighter because especially with skin tones and facial features, extreme shadows generally don't make people look better. So if I move the shadow area to the right, I can go all the way to the right and you can see we completely eliminate it, but that doesn't look natural or even any better. But keeping it up a little bit, we can just lighten the shadows a little bit and alleviate some of the heaviness in the photo. Moving on to the highlight area, those are going to be our lighter areas, and we can do the same thing. I can bring the highlights down or I can slide them to the right, and you can see we're going to get those red areas of blown out detail. So if I just move it back to where I regained the detail, we've gained some lighter areas, and we've essentially have increased the contrast of the photo by deepening the blacks and lightening the whites. Therefore, we don't really need this contrast filter right now. Later on at the end of the process or further down the line, we can adjust contrast if we need to, but doing it at this point will probably only result in losing detail or valuable information in the photo. Going on to the exposure slider, that's our middle values in the photo. So sliding that to the right to try to lighten it up, you can see it lightened everything up, but now we're starting to get some blown out areas in the highlights again. So if I go back to the white slider and slide that back to the left, you can see I've regained that detail while I've also have lightened the shadows. So overall, at this point, that's what we started with. That's what we've got right now. You can see we've made a really big improvement. But we can do more. I can go in now and do a more targeted approach. We still have fairly dark areas here around the eyes. So in Photoshop, I can go to this mask icon here, and I can select a brush. And the brush I can change in size. You can see how big it is here. I want to make it a little bit smaller. I'm going to bring it down to about an 8 here. And I can adjust the feathering of the brush too, how abruptly it ends at the edges. I want it kind of soft. So I'm just going to paint in a little bit over the eyes here, just in the shadow areas on both eyes. And what this signifies is that's going to be where our area of adjustment is, and everything else around this is not going to be affected. So I've created my mask. That's what the red area is showing. And then if I go down to the slider and begin to adjust it, I can bring up the shadows, which will start to lighten it a little bit. And I can bring up the exposure to just generally bring up the light, to generally lighten the whole area. I don't want to do it too much. You can see what happens there. It becomes very unnatural. But just doing it a little bit, we can start seeing that we're regaining detail in the eyes, and we're getting some life back into that. We still want to retain blacks. I mean, I could open up the black area too, but then we kind of lose the deep part of the color, the black. We lose a lot of contrast, and I really don't want to do that. So I'm going to leave the blacks alone and set that back to 0. So now we've got the eyes a little bit better, but I still have some shadow areas around the mouth and the cheeks here. So I'm going to create another mask. So I'm going to hit on Create Mask again, use another brush, and just paint in a little bit around the cheeks here and under the nose. And again, this mask signifies that I'm just going to affect that area here around the mouth, and everything else is going to be untouched. So again, I'm going to raise the exposure a little bit, and I'm going to raise the shadows a little bit, again, to lighten it up. And you can see we've regained a lot of detail and a lot of life back into the face of the baby. And finally, I'm going to make one more mask, a third mask, because I see the shadows on his forehead and above his nose. So I'm going to paint in a little bit there. Again, so that's going to be the only area affected, and go back to my exposure again, bring that up a little bit, and you can see we've lightened it up and we've eliminated a lot of the shadow. So we've certainly have gained a lot of enhancements here at this point. Now the background is pretty light, which can be nice, but we could also darken this background a little bit if we want to direct the eye more towards the face, to keep the face as the lightest part of the image. So if I go to Create Mask and go to Linear Gradient, then I can go, starting at the left side here, I can drag across, and the gradient will show that it has maximum effect where it begins at this red dot here on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side of it, it goes to 0. And again, I can adjust my exposure. If I bring it down instead of up, like what we did before, it'll darken the background a little bit. And I can do the same thing on the right-hand side. So I'll do it again. I'll say Create Mask, Linear Gradient, and this time I'll start on the right-hand side, drag across. I've got the mask. I'm going to lower the exposure a little bit. And you can see the same thing. So now we've got, did, 1, 2, 3, 4. We did 5 masks targeting each individual area. And we darkened the background a little bit. And the eye now is directed more towards the face. And you can see the before, the deep shadows on the face, and now the after, where we've regained a lot of detail back into the baby. So just to recap, we analyzed the photo, we made a plan of what we needed to do. We set our deepest blacks in our shadow areas, then we set our lightest whites in our highlights. and then we adjusted the midtones, and after doing all the global adjustments, then we went in and did some targeted adjusting as well.